Mahmud II did not only abolish the Janissaries, he devastated and slaughtered them. And this bloodbath he called Auspicious Event. But why auspicious? From the point of view of the Sultan, the answer is clear. But of course this is not the full truth. Many things have been and are still said about the auspicious event. All of those things include interpretations of what happened on the 15th of June 1826. Let's discuss the main points of view. First, there is a perspective which I call the Sultan's perspective, because it sees the actions of Mahmud II favorably, and the Sultan would like you to believe this version. I call the second point of view the Janissaries perspective. I use this name because it sees the Janissaries favorably. The Janissaries most likely would want you to believe this version. And finally, I will venture to provide my own interpretation. Let's get started. Nearly every paper about the auspicious event starts by describing the so-called traditional interpretation, which I call Mahmud II's perspective. The core of Mahmud's argument is simple. The Janissaries were past their usefulness. The high numbers drained the treasuries, since they not only proved unable to bring in new conquests, but even failed to defend the empire. The traditional literature attributes this lack of success to a decline in discipline and moral, which originated in the abolition of Nizam-i. The lax recruitment criteria and a lack of education eroded the Janissaries' esprit de corps. Instead of the Sultan, the Janissaries now owed their loyalty to themselves and their families. In the end, the many lost battles were a negative selection process. The best died on the battlefields, while the worst grew rich through corruption. In the words of Suna, historians argued that the Janissaries of the 18th and the early 19th century were composed of the riffraff or the criminal elements of Ottoman society. Thus their actions targeted and harmed not only the central authority but also the people. Janissaries were responsible for defeats at the hands of the enemies of Islam. Notwithstanding their ineffectiveness, they also became a body of lawless rogues terrorizing law-abiding subjects and the state. Thus, the abolition of the corps was a crucial service, both to the Ottoman society and the state. Following this narrative, the abolition of the Janissaries was essential to bring the Ottoman state over into the modern world. The Janissaries allied with and even represented various economic, religious and political power groups within Ottoman society. When modern institutions were to be introduced, the Ottoman state could not carry out modern reforms as fully as it wished because of the pre-existing structures and the society's unwillingness to adapt to new institutions. The resistance from different groups within the society made it difficult for the Ottoman government to implement these modern changes. From this point of view, the Janissaries could be seen as the most backwards and reactionary agents of special interest groups. Thus it was that a group of usurpers profited from the privileges of their call and pretended to constitute a kind of commercial middle class. Their commerce, however, was always based on encroachment on other businesses and the unhindered use of military privileges and allowances to exploit the revenue sources of the state and the economy of the land. They were brutes whom no one could hope to reform. With the rebel disposed of and the mob leaderless, the government could then re-establish its authority throughout the empire, and, under a central autocracy, a whole series of reforms could begin at last. First and foremost in the army, which tottered from defeat to defeat, such as the horrendous massacre of Turks in the Peloponnese in 1822, for which the Janissaries could be blamed. This was the more detailed part about the Janissaries becoming an undisciplined mob of robbers who terrorized the empire's population, but proved unable to defend it while stopping every serious attempt of reforms. Let's also go into more detail about the burden on the treasury. The invalidation of the Janissary pay tickets simply meant that the state treasury was relieved of a large amount of domestic debt overnight. The Ottoman government could now do much more compared to the times when there were still Janissaries around. They could debase the currency whenever they felt like it, and they felt like it between 1826 and 1834, with the largest debasement in Ottoman history. Furthermore, they could also increase taxes, take on debt or cancel it without noteworthy resistance. In the end, the Ottoman government had the society in its hand. Most of the revenue the Sultan used for his new army. For this point of view, he replaced one insatiable institution with another, although he had full control of this one. Goodwin provides a good summary of the Sultan's position. Janissary democracy was that of the Bar per law, until at last the state had had enough. The core left behind nothing that could be used in the 20th century. Their years of glory had a dying fall. So much for the Sultan's perspective. But this is only one side of the story. One could get the impression that everything that went wrong after the second half of the 16th century was the fault of the Janissaries. Fortunately, some historians went to length to study the Janissaries' motives. That enables us to look at the other side of the argument. We've heard that the Janissaries turned to trade in the second half of the 16th century. They simply had to do it because the employer, the state, devalued their salary by inflation. Other economic groups faced similar problems. Such an alliance came about. Just like the Janissaries struggle against the unstable value of the salaries due to currency fluctuations, the craftsmen were trying to protect themselves from deteriorating economic conditions by gaining tax exemption through obtaining military rank. In the early 19th century, Janissary involvement in crafts and trades became one of the prevalent characteristics of urban life in many of the Ottoman cities. As a result of the transformations from the late 16th century onward, the Janissaries put down roots in urban economy and society. By using the privileges of the military status, they became one of the substantial forces in urban centers that the Ottoman state was compelled to come to terms with. The Ottoman viziers and even the rulers were involved in the economic sphere as early as the foundation of the Ottoman state, and they were neither questioned nor criticized for their commercial activities. It is clear that the Ottomans never drew a clear-cut distinction between military and economic activity. But the connections between Janissaries and civil society went beyond a guy with a Janissary title running a coffee shop or something similar. Junior officers managed the regiment's treasuries, and their function was also to lend money. This was not corruption, rather it was expected of them. They invested the author's money and supported the little shopkeepers, who very often were their comrades at the same time. Obviously, the result was a network between the Janissaries and the local social groups. Very often they even occupied important positions in the local guilds. A prominent example is the Tanners Guild in Edirne. After the abolition of the Janissaries, the governor stationed more than 100 soldiers in the tanneries to keep this guild under control. In the last video about the Auspicious Event, we have learned that even at the peak of the Janissaries' power, the Sultan still proclaimed the Aga of the Janissaries and other officers. It was the junior officers who spoke for the interests of the Janissaries and their allies and, if necessary, instigated a rebellion. Suna studied 490 cases of Janissaries from Istanbul and Edirne, executed or exiled in the aftermath of the Auspicious Incident. He comes to the conclusion that 334 of them also were traders, artists or artisans. This is 68%. Due to problems with identifying such titles, Suna sees this number as a minimum. I think this is proof enough that the Janissaries intermingled with lower economic classes, and that connections between state functionaries and special interest groups were absolutely normal. For the shopkeepers and craftsmen, the Janissaries represented a cause in standoffs with the government. Rather than labeling the crowds which participated in the rebellions as riffraff or reactionaries, Mardin and Timur emphasized the role of Janissaries and their allies in protecting the traditional Ottoman liberties by limiting the power of the ruling elite and sultans. Arguing that a tacit social contract existed between the rulers and their subjects in the Ottoman political structure, Mardin claimed that if, for any reason, the ruling elite and the Sultan attempted to violate this implicit contract, the subjects then would react by resorting to a series of actions varying from protest to open rebellion. With this, the Janissaries' military task became secondary. They were nothing more than an urban militia. What I find curious about this interpretation is that the Janissaries, being shopkeepers, does not fit the traditional looting of Istanbul during revolts. Shopkeepers usually are the first targets of plunderers. But enough of that. Let's try to develop our own explanation. Two interpretations of the Janissaries' role in society. 2 points of view which contradict each other. Maybe, just maybe, we are smarter than everyone else is, and we have a better approach to make sense of what happened back then. To achieve this, we will draw our own conclusions from the points of view presented before. So on the one hand, we have the Sultan. His claim is to modernize his empire and therefore also end the corruption in the military. On the other hand, there are the Janissaries. Their stated purpose is to fight off the government's attempts on the right of the ordinary people. While the older literature supports the Sultan's claims, modern scholars prefer to talk about the Janissaries' point of view. I might add that I'm not very surprised by this. The interpretation dominates, which fits to the culture of the respective time. Here's my problem with both interpretations. If the Sultan had the intention to get rid of the corruption and the exploitation of the state by the Janissaries, how does that fit to his own actions? As we have seen, the first thing he did after the Auspicious Event was to bring 10 years of debasement and new taxes. Using hindsight, we also know that the Sultan's modernizations at least were not enough to enable the empire to face the Europeans. The same holds for the Janissaries. If the claim is to protect the middle class against inflation and a too high tax burden, why did they exploit the position of power for hundreds of years by extracting more tax money? In the end, whenever the Janissaries failed to conquer booty, the honest citizens had to pay their salaries. They collected fees and used the jobs to blackmail people. They even plundered Istanbul more than once. Whatever the claims of both sides, their actions speak for themselves. As soon as they had the chance, the Sultan as well as the Janissaries used the state in which they were embedded in order to further their own welfare. At this point we can gain some insight by looking back to the video about the Ottoman deep state run by the Janissaries. The Ottoman Empire provided to the benefit a welfare-warfare state of the enlisted man, as well as a military-agricultural complex for the junior and senior officers. This is an exchange relationship between the government, symbolized by the Sultan, and the military, symbolized by the Janissaries. However, such institutions will eventually degenerate. The military's job is war, and that in return is a deadly business. Therefore, soldiers have a huge incentive to avoid war, but maintain the income gained for their supposed service. Who should force a high-status military and internally powerful institution like the Janissary Corps to do their job? The military is the instrument of the state's monopoly of violence. There is no one who can do that. In the beginning, the Janissaries were only part of all the military power of the empire, and thereby were under the pressure of, for example, the Sipahis. Furthermore, conquests provided much more opportunities than simply exploiting the local population. But this changed. The Janissaries became more and more important compared to other branches of arms. Karajan explains very well how they strengthened their power in negotiations with other institutions in the empire. He formulated his idea in a matrix. The negotiation power of the military depends on their corporate identity, as well as its centrality in the respective state. The more central an army's role and the stronger the corporate identity, the bigger is its negotiation power. Let's look where the Janissaries fit in this matrix. They had a central role in the Ottoman state through them being the main military apparatus, the high influence in important middle-class economic groups and the fixation of the empire on expansion. At the same time, the corporate identity was very high. We have heard enough about this in the episodes on the Janissaries' creed. Being a Janissary meant high prestige and privileges. This earned the Janissaries a place of a veto player in the decision-making in the empire's administration. But this strong role also meant that it became easier for them to draw resources from the empire's big population than fighting a dangerous war. In this case, the only task the military has to provide is to keep the state alive. For example, a conquest of Istanbul by the Russians would be catastrophic, but it never came close to that anyway. Now we can see the problems the Sultans had. Drawing resources from the population and giving orders to their liking was their job. and the Janissaries appropriated it. Not only did the sultans lose the services provided by the Janissaries, they also had to give up their other rights. In the end, just like every potentate that ever ruled, their aim was to rule to their liking, expand their dominion, and exploit it by every means they saw fit. This brings me to the very obvious conclusion that in the struggle between the Sultan and the Janissaries, we see factions fighting over the control over the state. Both were institutions of the Ottoman state and tried to use the bigger construct to do whatever they wanted. In this sense, what the Sultan called modernization just meant shut up and do my bidding, while the Janissaries' answer was stop complaining and let us take whatever we want. This leaves one last big question. If the Janissaries were the instrument of the state's monopoly of violence, how could something like the Auspicious Incident happen? They could easily have done away with the artillery corps and other units who might have posed a threat to them. Ustun touches this question and hands us a starting point for our thought process. In the end, they were still the soldiers of the government. It is crucial to understand this dual nature of the Janissary Corps. Yet it was the alignment with certain groups in Ottoman society that prompted the Ottoman state's decision to destroy the Janissaries, rather than a mere technical necessity to replace a corrupt army with a stronger one. Let's look at this from this point of view. History has proven that the Sultan is able to abolish the Janissaries. However, would it have been possible for the Janissaries to abolish the Ottoman dynasty? At the very pinnacle of the Ottoman system stood the Sultan, whose rule over his dominion was, in theory, absolute. Even those sultans who were not capable rulers could at least set themselves up as a rallying point, one which all of their subjects, Christian or Muslim, Turk or Slav, shared in common. Surely, the Janissaries had forced sultans to step down or even killed them. Nevertheless, they never dared to do away with the dynasty. The very point about Mahmud II was that he was the only candidate for the throne. He had no brothers, uncles or nephews left. In the end, this made him untouchable, and the slaughter of the Janissaries was a foregone conclusion. And this brings us back to Qadr Khan. We have positioned the Janissaries in his matrix. Now we will do the same with the Ottoman dynasty. The corporate identity of the sultans in the sense of Qadr Khan was just exorbitant. Furthermore, there was nothing more central in the Ottoman Empire than a reigning Ottoman sultan, and at this time it was Mahmud II who occupied this position, and he overshadowed every other institution in the empire. The central importance of the royal family in the state also served as an effective bond. In many multinational states that are not united by religion, ethnicity or a common way of life, the royal family or even an individual can come to define a state more than anything else. The Janissaries held the guns, but it was no use to them. Mahmud's power was much bigger, although only existing in the people's brains. It was sacrosanct. It would take a world war and strong enemies covering up the empire to do away with the dynasty. We all should take a moment to think about all the authority figures which are deeply embedded in our heads, and who would not have any power without that. People and institutions who are just as sacrosanct as the Ottoman sultans. This leaves the question: was the abolition of the Janissaries to the benefit of the empire? What a tough question to ask. One thing is clear: in the Ottomans' fight against the European powers, it surely did not turn the tide. The Ottoman Empire stayed of secondary relevance and never was a threat again. Of course, with the Janissaries still existing, it could have been worse, but that is hard to prove. It also does not necessarily seem that the ordinary citizen's life became easier. Indeed, Suna claims that the new taxes introduced by Mahmud II were lower than the fees the Janissaries demanded. The problem is that this statement, as so many others, ignores inflation, which the Janissaries always opposed, so we cannot come up with a good comparison. The argument in favor of the Sultan would be that it probably is cheaper for the people to pay for an enormously rich court instead of hundreds of thousands modestly wealthy soldiers. Furthermore, the citizens did not only continue to give their property to the state, Now they also gave their blood, since the new Mansur army, the trained victorious soldiers of Muhammad, just like Salim III's New Order army, relied on a draft system and moved more and more towards conscription. Suna puts this together nicely. In truth, the abolition of the Janissary Corps was a step taken to consolidate the state's power and to eliminate the most powerful base for popular opposition. Once the power of the Janissaries was broken, the central administration could make increasing demands on the population in terms of taxes and manpower, and the commoners had no longer any chance to influence the decision-making process or to resist the application of these decisions. Nevertheless, I think it would be better to speak of the Sultan's power instead of the state. Since the Janissaries were a state institution, the domestic power of the state never was in question. The question only was who reaped the benefits of this power. The imperial army increasingly became an immense corporation whose purpose was the exploitation of the country through the administrative and fiscal organization of the state. And this is a good place to stop and take a look at what we learned today. The literature mainly approaches interpretations of the auspicious event from two perspectives. First, from the point of view of the Sultan. The abolition of the corrupt Janissaries was necessary to modernize particularly the army and the whole empire in general. Second, the Janissaries resisted the government's demands because they intermingled with the lower socio-economic classes and therefore stood up against the Sultan. Taxes and inflation are examples of such government infringements. My own interpretation goes beyond that. I see the face-off between the Sultan and the Janissaries as a conflict about the control of the state. In a propaganda-like attempt, both sides try to point out what good they did to the general population, but their actions contradict them, since both sides force payments from the citizens, be it fees and salaries on the one side or taxes and inflation on the other. In the case of the Sultan, he also demanded blood. In the end, the Janissaries had the deep state, but the Sultan wanted to bring it under his control. It nearly was a necessity that the Sultan would win. His position as an institution was just too strong. Following my interpretation provides another insight. The proponents of the first view, which sees the auspicious event as an act by the Sultan who took back what was rightfully his, usually are older and more traditional. The interpretation that the Janissaries were an institution of the people and its abolition is more modern. Following my interpretation, which sees the auspicious event as the end of a fight over the state as an instrument for special interests, the shift from one point of view to another is not a big surprise. For example, around 1900 the common view was that the control of the empire was the divine right of the Sultan. Today, the state as an institution is meant to express the will of the people, well, more realistically, the will of a coalition of groups of people. My interpretation fits perfectly to this change in the views of historians. The auspicious event was a battle over the control of the state. There was no good or evil involved. It depended on the subjective views. A person losing or winning his status as a beneficiary of the state could easily see the event as evil or good, respectively. And now, it is your turn again. Do you see any scenario in which the Janissaries or any other institution could triumph over the Sultan in the long run? Tell me in the comments. Please do not forget to like, share and subscribe. So long, we'll meet again soon. Stay critical, stay curious, stay free.